Okay. Well, where we left off last time was talking about 20th century planning. And one of the major developments in post-war architecture is suburban shopping mall. And it starts off early on, essentially like strip malls, and developments, but the actual shopping mall, the first indoor shopping mall is built in 1956, the Southdale Shopping Center in Edina, Minnesota. The architect was Victor Gruen and Associates. And let me click here next. Victor Gruen was actually a Bauhaus trained, fully international style Austrian architect. He worked for Peter Behrens, who we talked about previously, and came to the US in the 1930s, like a lot of other German architects, flee the Nazis, wound up settling in LA, worked in the international style for quite a while, but he began a specialized career in retail development and is the one credited with creating the concept, essentially architecturally, of the shopping mall, which, in the second half of the 20th century was a really big deal, although they're really falling out of favor at this time. So here's a historic view of the original shopping mall in Southdale. And the concept of the shopping mall is in a way borrowed from the old Main Street, commercial downtown focus, which tended to be where department stores were, and those were always the sort of a big draw. People would want to come downtown. They'd go to the big go to the big department store, but they would also often walk up and down the street and they might visit the smaller shops as well. And so the planning concept for the shop, the suburban shopping mall was to have these major department store anchors. One here, one right here on the right, another one, Dayton's, which I'm not sure Dayton's is still around, on the left. And then in between would be a walkway with smaller retail stores and often with a food court. And this really served as the new downtown, but in a suburban setting. And in fact, it essentially killed off many downtowns of small towns and smaller cities, because the big department store, they up and left their downtown location and moved out to the suburb. The little shops followed them because they depend on the traffic generated from these big anchors, and that left a lot of vacancies in our downtowns. And I'll talk about the counter reaction to that development very shortly. And so they're typically flooded around they're an island in a sea of parking, because it depends on, as we talked last time, you have to have an automobile to get here. You can't just walk, down from your house. It's almost impossible even to take a bus or something here because of the suburban sprawled development. It's just not as efficient to do that. Here's an indoor historic view of the interior, and the designers, Gruen and future designers of malls, they really endeavored to create a very pleasant atmosphere, almost like a idealistic Main Street, but without all of the sort of hassles and downsides to the old downtowns. No crumbling buildings. They're indoor, so they're climate controlled in the winter, especially like in Minnesota. It's nice in winter, and in the South it's nice in summer because it's just flooded with air conditioning. They would plant trees and shrubberies and flowers to make it pretty. There'd be lots of seating where you could sit and relax. The food court, of course, where you could hang out. You could have a meal in between your shopping. You could spend hours and hours here. And this is what families would do. I don't know how many of you grew up like this, but when I was a kid, and I was probably about middle school age, I could go to the mall with my mom and she would tell me, okay, in 2 hours, meet back at such and such, and I'd be off on my own. And it was safe and I could do whatever I wanted. It was sort of a little bit of freedom and independence. And that was a big advantage to a shopping mall. There was no traffic. You weren't going to get hit by a bus, and you weren't going to get mugged in a dark alley, and all the kinds of fears and things that people have about and conceptions people have of downtowns. They have their own security system and so forth. So there were a lot of strong advantages to this, and they thrived in the retail environment of the second half of the 20th century. And one could argue that they hit their peak in the 1990s. This is the Mall of America in Bloomingdale, Minnesota from 1992. This was the largest shopping mall, at least in the United States. I think it was the largest shopping mall in the world at the time it was built. And it was so big, some of the stores actually repeated themselves and were in, repeated in different wings. And it just 3 levels, sprawled out over acres and acres of territory. And this is how people shop. This is before the internet. This is before Amazon. And if you wanted to buy something, you had to go physically buy it. I mean, there were catalogs and you could order things from catalogs, but it just wasn't the same as going here. And it was almost a social event as well. There were movie theaters, and you could, the kids could go to a movie while mom shopped, or dad. And like I say, you could go to the food court and get a meal. At the Mall of America, they had an amusement park in there. This is how big this was. And so the little kids could be dropped off at the amusement park while mom went off and shopping or something like that. So this wasn't just retail, it was cultural as well. And like I say, it has a dramatic impact on how we did shopping, and it had a negative impact on the commercial centers of communities, which were really left for decades to struggle on how to respond to that. So a lot of these planning developments, the suburban development, the white flight, the disinvestment of our inner cities, and the abandonment of the retail environment, housing projects, urban renewal, in which you bulldoze city block after city block in order to build new buildings that often, as we saw, might be torn down within a couple of decades because they were poorly built and maintained. And so this really leads to a counter movement starting in the 1960s mostly, and it's a preservation movement in which a growing group of planners and architects and the public at large begin to say, hey, wait a minute, we are just destroying everything that has been built for decades and centuries in a matter of 1 or 2 decades, and that it's senseless and it's a waste. There's an embodied energy that is used in order to build a building that when you throw it in a landfill, it's gone and it's now wasted and it can't be recycled and reused. And so in 1966, there's enough political pressure that Congress passes the Preservation Act, and this allows for local communities to establish preservation commissions that might designate landmarks and oversee what kinds of alterations or prevent demolitions to local landmarks. It requires the federal government to review its actions and the impact it might have on historic resources. This can include, building a new highway that slices through an urban neighborhood. Does that have an adverse impact on historic resources in that neighborhood? Or it could be, building a new federal office building or something like that. And it also created the National Register of Historic Places, which is really just a database of historic resources. The National Register doesn't actually prevent people from tearing down buildings, but it certainly allows people to judge whether something is historic or not. And it's actually local commissions that can be established that perhaps have control over demolitions and over alterations. Not all communities adapt that. Oak Park is a leader in doing it. Chicago has a very strong preservation commission. So, and this is actually an image here of Richard Nickel, who was a pioneering Chicago preservationist who fell in love with Louis Sullivan, Adler and Sullivan and Louis Sullivan architecture in the 1950s, and was dismayed at the rapid destruction that was occurring of his work, and began a movement with a small group to, start protesting this demolition. And this is the Garrick Theater that Adler and Sullivan had designed, and he's protesting the proposed demolition, which ultimately did occur. And I'll talk more about Richard Nickel. He's essentially a preservation martyr for Chicago. He was a great photographer and documented a lot of these Sullivan buildings before they were demolished. And he also salvaged a lot of ornament. Some of the ornament that you see in that great stair hall at the Art Institute of Sullivan ornamentation was actually salvaged by Richard Nickel. So nationally speaking, one of the things that really spurred the broader preservation movement was the demolition of Penn Station. And I talked about this when we were talking about neoclassical Beaux-Arts architecture in America. This was designed by McKim, Mead and White, finished in 1910. And this was this massive, full block train station. And the train concourses were actually underground. And the building that we see here was just on the surface. There were waiting rooms and ticketing and all kinds of other railroad offices and services. And in the 1960s, the railroads were all struggling, including the Pennsylvania Railroad. And they felt that to maintain the building, to have all this space, was sort of unnecessary. And if they were able to tear down their building and build something else, they could get a huge cash infusion from a developer, and they could still have their railroad, trains and loading all underground. And it was a big fight, but at the time, the railroad won, and the building, in fact, was torn down in 1963. But this really spurred a backlash nationally, both in the city of New York, which established a landmarks ordinance for New York City, but also around the country. People saw this, a destruction of such a beautiful building as a real waste. And what we got in return was Madison Square Garden, which is a popular venue for sporting events and other activities, but is nowhere near, I think just about everybody could agree that the design aesthetic of Madison Square Garden seen here doesn't even come close to the original Penn Station. And when people saw what replaced it, they said, wait a minute, this is what we get out of this? So this really helps lead to this broader preservation movement. And in Chicago, one of the sort of catalyst for it is the fight over the Chicago Stock Exchange. This was an Adler and Sullivan building from 1894, sat on LaSalle Street. I think it was at LaSalle in Washington, if I'm not mistaken, and was a fantastic example of the Chicago school and a beautiful example of Louis Sullivan's work in partnership with Adler. And in fact, Richard Nickel really was a leader in trying to save this building, and they were unsuccessful. The building, in fact, was demolished, but he and John Vinci and Tim Samuelson, especially the three of them, worked hard to actually salvage quite a bit of ornamentation from the building before it was fully destroyed. They were working with the demolition contractor to do that. But there's a sad story here. Nickel kept going into the building even after he wasn't supposed to anymore, and the demolition was really going full throttle, and he would sneak in on weekends. And Tim Samuelson, who I know, who's the cultural historian for Chicago now, he was just a young man at the time, and he was supposed to meet Nickel on some Sunday afternoon. He was going to sneak back in the building, grab a few more things, and meet up with Tim to help him carry it out of the building. And he waited in the alley, and he waited and he waited, and Nickel never showed up. And they found out that he had disappeared. And so they let the demolition contractor know, and they said, well, we don't see him anywhere in the building. It was about 2 weeks before they found his body buried in a pile of rubble, probably what happened is that there was some sort of shifting and a whole floor collapsed or something like that, and he was very tragically killed. So he's still well known in Chicago preservation circles as kind of the pioneer and martyr for the movement. But out of this, at the Art Institute is a reconstruction of the trading room from the old stock exchange. This was rebuilt by architect John Vinci, who's a very accomplished modernist architect. Most of his work is in the sort of Misesian modernist style, but he's also a preservationist, kind of one of those rare dual architects where he fully embraces modern architecture, but he appreciates and values the historic architecture and has done a lot of great preservation work as well. So they rebuilt the trading room in conjunction with the school, with the Art Institute. And it's not usually open. It's in a back wing, and it's not usually open, but they do have events and meetings and so forth here. And so if you ever get the chance to check it out, I think even if you wander back there, if there's nothing going on, you can usually peek in and take a look at it. But it's a great way to see Sullivan's decoration and design schemes. It's a really beautiful space. And on the outside, on the back along Columbus Avenue, is a reconstruction of the terracotta entry arch. And so Nickel and Vinci and Samuelson salvaged this, and they put Vinci designed a concrete arch, on the as a backer, and they rebuilt the terracotta along the face here. So now it is like this giant piece of sculpture outside of the Art Institute. So it's a little odd to see it, almost a little sad to see it this way, but it's also nice that they were able to salvage and rebuild this. So these sorts of efforts, started in the 1960s and really began to take off in the 1970s, but preservation is now fully mainstream and was especially big in the 90s with economic boom in the 90s and has continued on into the 21st century as well. And there's always conflicts, there's always going to be challenges where somebody wants to tear down a building for new development and there's going to fight to save it. Sometimes the preservationists win, sometimes the development team wins, and it can be a trade-off, but at least there is now that dialogue and discussion, and whereas that didn't happen in the 1950s and early 60s, it was just, we're going to do this, we're going to demo it, and really nobody could stand in their way. But there was also, the preservation movement also began to realize that this can't just be about saving monuments, saving, important buildings for old white men, to be quite honest, which is really some of the earliest preservation movement was, saving southern plantations, the epitome of monuments to white men, disregarding the cultural and history of minorities and other groups in our country. But in the 1970s, the National Trust for Historic Preservation began to realize that something had to be done about community preservation. And it isn't just about saving this building or that building because they're really important or they were designed by an important architect, but we have to save communities. And it was a reaction to this suburban development changes, that retail and the flight of people out of city centers. And they established a program, a pilot program in 1976 in 4 different small towns across the country, mostly in the Midwest, one of them being Madison, Indiana, to create a preservation approach to revitalizing small towns and small town commercial districts. And they called it the Main Street program because, that's sort of the general term you use for the commercial strip in a small town is Main Street, even though sometimes they're given different street names. And Madison, Indiana is this incredible historic town right on the Ohio River in southeast Indiana. It's a good drive from here, but if you ever get the chance, it's about an hour and a half from Columbus. So if you go to Columbus, Indiana, which we talked about in an earlier lecture, you take the initiative and drive down to Madison as well. It's just a beautiful little town, and I have a bias towards it because my parents actually ran a bed and breakfast here in the 1990s in an old, 1850s Greek Revival house in town. And so here's a view of Madison in the 1950s, and you can see, all the cars. This was where everybody went to shop, and there all the restaurants were here, and you went out. Young people went out on Friday and Saturday nights, and they hung out in downtown, and people, just this was the heart of the community. But starting in this post-war period, you start seeing strip malls and other commercial developments away, and it just emptied out the downtown. And there was almost no reason to come downtown anymore. This was typical of not just Madison, but just about every community around the country. And even in the bigger cities, there were still in Chicago, you still had all the office buildings and workers in the loop, but it would empty out at 5 o'clock. Everybody would go home to their suburban house or whatever, and the downtowns would be dead in the evenings. So here is a more contemporary view of Madison, and part of the program was really to help renovate the buildings and encourage people to come back. It wasn't just an architectural program. It was also about providing business assistance and management, almost creating the structure that shopping malls had. A shopping mall is run by a management team. They handle leasing, they handle the aesthetics of the common spaces, in this case like a streetscape in a downtown, and they would replicate that. They were using the lessons that shopping malls had created and how they run and operate, and they began to apply that to these downtown commercial spaces, and it's been pretty successful. It's grassroots, it's community-based, and some communities thrive with it and some have struggled with it. Next slide here is of Galena, Illinois. This is a huge success, and on any nice weekend in the spring, summer, and fall, you show up in Galena and it is packed with tourists. And this is a broader theme of heritage tourism, which has become a massive industry, at least in the pre-COVID pandemic day, in which people want to visit places that have a lot of character, and to shop in galleries and knickknack shops and fudge shops, and some of them can be kind of tacky tourist stuff, and some of them can be higher end. Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I have a place, I mean, that's really high end art galleries. It's the third largest art market in the United States. And you could go to Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and it's mostly ticky-tack, tourist trinkets or whatever. But the point is that people want to get away to places that offer something special and unique, and historic architecture can provide that. A town like Galena, which struggled, I mean, it died off in the early 20th century for various reasons, and nothing happened here. And for many, many decades, this was a really dead, depressed town. But starting in the 70s and since then, 1970s, it has really thrived on heritage tourism. And that even goes off into things like we have locally, the Right Plus house tours that I've volunteered with for many years. This is, people are willing to come from all over the world, in the case of Wright Plus, to look at old houses, especially ones designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. But almost every community that has historic architecture will have a annual house walk, and people are really curious to see. Sometimes they just want to see somebody's kitchen or how they redid the bathroom, but they just want to see really beautiful historic architecture, because we don't build new houses like this anymore, and most people can't afford a big grand house like this in Oak Park. And so this is an opportunity to kind of be an architectural voyeur, as I like to call it. And I'm not going to get into details about restoration, but in general, I'm a preservation architect. I should also add that I have an affinity for the Main Street program, because that was my first job out of college, was working for the Illinois Main Street program as a designer. But this is a whole direction in architecture of people who focus on preserving and restoring historic buildings, because they need a lot of work. This is the Reliance Building, a great Chicago school building by Burnham and Company. And you see on the left, this is how it looked historically. Actually, in the 1930s, it was already really deteriorating by then because, you know, by the 30s, you know, this building was 50 years old, and there were bigger buildings, there were newer buildings with more modern amenities that were being built, and it, you know, it struggled during the Depression. It was hard to maintain, and you know, when the building owner isn't getting the rents, they're not going to put investment in maintenance, and so these really declined. And this is how, in the middle, this is how it looked in the early 1990s. The cornice was gone. The terracotta was failing badly. It was very dirty. It had a mishmash of signage on it, and so there was a real effort in the mid to late 90s to restore not just this building. This is emblematic of the kind of restoration efforts that were really taking off in the 80s and 1990s and early 2000s. And this was beautifully restored. You know, again, I'm biased. I worked on this project, but into a boutique hotel, and that is also reflecting what we call adaptive reuse, which is that many older buildings, they can't be used for their original purpose. This floor plate for an office building just doesn't work functionally anymore. And so, you know, the exterior was restored, and the building was converted into a boutique hotel, which is part of the heritage tourism industry, in that, you know, you can go to a Hilton hotel and you know what kind of room you're going to get because every Hilton is alike. But a boutique hotel was a concept developed in the 1990s, which is that, hey, it's almost like a bed and breakfast on steroids, in which each room might be a little different. It has historic character. It's really, you know, high design aesthetic to it. The price point is higher, but you're getting something a little more special than, you know, your typical Hampton Inn on the roadside. And so this, you know, was a huge boom in places like Chicago, in which these smaller office buildings from the Chicago School would be converted both into boutique hotels or into residences, which was originated, right, with Marina City in the 1960s, the idea of people living in downtown. And that has really boomed, both with student housing as well as just general rental and condo developments in downtown Chicago. And so now after 5 o'clock, the city has more life on it, and there's restaurants that are open and so forth, because people are living there and they're walking in and out of their home, and they're going to restaurants, and they're doing activities in the city in the evening hours. These are just some photos of the lobby restoration, which I worked on personally. And you see on the left is a historic view of it. It had been completely destroyed in the intervening years, and we, using the historic photos and some historic drawings, we recreated the marble and the ironwork and the terrazzo, or the mosaic floor. It's really an over-the-top design space. And this is open. It's still a hotel. The hotel itself changed since, but you can walk into the lobby. There's a restaurant in the main space, but you can walk into this lobby. You can even take the elevator up to, I think, the 8th or 9th or 11th floor are great ones. So just ride the elevator and see the old historic corridors in the upside or upstairs. But you can also just check out the lobby here. All right, so that finishes preservation.